We are here for a special holiday edition of Listening Party to the Lyme Letters audiobook. I appreciate the presence of C.R. Grimmer and her holiday decorations, which provide just the right amount of ambiance for this conversation. But I wonder what you think of the idea of poetry audiobooks and whether or not you think it's a useful thing.
I mean, poetry is supposed to be the genre where it is like rhythm and sound first. It is the musical genre, right? Like if you're going to talk about like written genres before you get to the point where it's has a musical accompaniment, you usually end up in poetry land before you hit up straight up music lyrics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, poetry, the like form existed to help people memorize poems so they could retell them without the like need for electronics or instruments.
Yeah.
I mean, we feel sound in our bodies, and if it's like it has a certain catch to it, we keep carrying it forward. So to me, like it makes sense that poetry audiobooks would be a frontier that poetry should expand on. It sounded weirdly colonial, so maybe I'll reframe that as it could be like a space for people to really explore and play a little bit more. But I think that what it also reveals is when people read in the same voice over and over.
Yeah.
And like it can get very monotonous. Like poem A is not the same poem as poem B, but when it's read like it's the same poem. And like if you ask like non-poets and even poets, like they get bored at poetry readings.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like assuming they'll listen to a whole book of it without any narrative or anything else to pull it through, like you have to really like sound.
I always think also of the way that readers negotiate white space in poems is one of the things that I always find interesting. But in order to kind of navigate that at a poetry reading, you have to have the book right in front of you so that you see the decisions being made, which, by the way, I recommend if you're new to the world of going to poetry readings, bring the book. It's interesting and you'll pick up on stuff. There are some poets I've seen who change poems on the fly. Today I've picked two poems. One is more prosy, one is a little more spacey. Those are very technical editing terms that you might not understand, and that's okay. But so are you all right if we go ahead and jump in and listen?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, so we're going to start, if you're following along, on page 62, My Dearest Family Members, Blood Co-op, and Never-Ending Transfusions. So I'm going to pull up the audio here, and we will listen, and then we will think. Give me just a second.
My dearest family members, Blood Co-op, and Never-Ending Transfusions. From Lyme from a Distance. There is a place in Germany called Laubach where deer run. A highly camped new forest. The bugs and the deer are famous for their Bergdorferei title in Lyme, Connecticut. Laubach, far away from Lyme, Connecticut, has the same type of bugs, which are called ticks. Some of the campers, mainly girls, like to tease each other with scratching fingers and say, "Tika, tika, tika, tika." The ritual does not prevent the ticks from leaping, deer flesh to human flesh. Some swear that deer and human blood taste same red smellish, with pooling heat as ticks prize. The tick ends its life after such pleasure, stops still and waits for it. Leaps to human and the one last swelling. This is not true. Ticks do not have desires. Ticks do not have worlds. They have only those smell temperatures. They wait in the green and often the blue for scent to creep close. Patient, they can wait as long as 18 years. We don't know how. We know their bite produces red halos, and even if they don't, we know how bitten becomes beast. This is how we know. They say a girl boy from Lyme, Connecticut, one day camped in Laubach. Playing with girls on the campground, desired a boy, desired a girl, but more than that, desired lake skin. Ticks smell first the reddest moments. The camper dripped with the smell of it. There is no way to know what happened, but they tell us the deer found her, and shortly after that, the ticks found them. This is how so many beasts are. Are.
Whoa.
What's out to you there?
Well, it's Michelle Glazer. She's faculty in my MFA program. And she's actually the first poet that I saw do a live reading where I was like enraptured. I like went with some of my like cohort, in my like mid-20s, early 20s. I think I was like 22, so early 20s. And she reads with like her whole body, and like she changes what she's reading. She changes how she reads with every poem.
Yeah.
And I feel like she uses every inch of her breath to do it. And so when I asked her to read, I was really shocked that she picked this series because it's a narrative prose series. They're prose blocks. They're like telling a story. It's the same story. It's just depending on how close up a camera would be, kind of thing, to the situation. And I was like, oh, I thought she'd pick a poem that had more form or was more lyrical, but she chose the narrative one. And then hearing her read it, it doesn't sound as much like this plus this equals this story. It sounds much more like we're just kind of in this space with her, and it sounds more fantastical.
Yeah.
Like it sounds like a fantasy novel almost.
Yeah, it does. I think that some of that is the very deliberate, even enunciation of every part of the sentence, and
Yeah.
sort of the unhurried pace combined with the evenness of tone is a really interesting and ambitious way to read a prose poem, because they can feel really long when you do it that way. And it is a longer recording, but there's a pivot point in the middle, which I hadn't noticed even when reading it the first time, which is that this is not true, which is the sort of the natural for me, like if we were fussing about where to break things, that's where you break it. But of course, it's a prose poem, so you don't break it. But that, when read in the exact sort of same paced cadence, stood out so much more to me than it would have in the reading, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's like a kind of buried line otherwise. Like I've never even really thought about it. I wrote
Yeah.
it. And then when she read it, I was like, oh.
Yeah. As soon as she read it, I was like, wow, what a powerful line that I hadn't
I know.
noticed before. Yeah. Well, let's pivot to
Yeah.
something totally different then.
Okay.
So we are now on page 83, My Dearest Blueness, Greatest Shiva and Ima, Closet Ama.
Yeah, that's very different.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna play it and then I'll let you react.
My dearest blueness, greatest Shiva and Ima, closest Ama. You memorize your verses, recite them each morning while the coffee drips minutes. You explain how they keep you from hearing the strawberry-skinned voice, how it keens in your head. You explain again how they keep me. Rosethorn, broken piano key, empty, browning house and its sun-tanned lawn. Can they grow a brain in a petri dish yet? I sew the spinal nerves into your e-reader. Is Book of David still your favorite? I promise that bath was an accident, just slipped into water and its sheen. An accident. I explain it again. Your gut flora will tell you when to stop the metronome. R.
A little different.
Yeah. And that's Abby Polikoff. She's actually coming over tonight to watch Grey's Anatomy with me. And this is the series of poems to the mother figure. And something that Abby and I actually bond over a lot is talking about our relationships to motherhood, which are wildly different. Abby's a Jewish American poet, but she got the references in these poems more, because these are the poems that stick with like Old Testament stories. So they're the retellings of stories. In this case, it would be like the Queen of Bathsheba, right? So the woman that King of David saw from his palace bathing on a rooftop. And it's a little bit of a joke about it. But
Yeah, does it feel a little bit like an inside joke when you listen to like people that you know more intimately engage with like a fairly intimate poem like this?
yeah. Like I know that she knows, like oftentimes when I've read this, I don't think people know the reference about the Book of David, the bath was an accident. Like
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of folks are raised in those stories anymore in the same way. Whereas I know that Abby is, and Abby
Yeah.
knows it. So like there's the inside joke in the poem, which I could take some heat for. I'd have a lot of inside jokes in poems. You're not supposed to do that. And then there's like the inside joke with the friend that knows the inside joke,
Yeah.
right? Where they're like, oh yeah, like this is how we joke about like these stories together, right? Because there's a kind of like ridiculousness to it. And then there's like the inside joke of like her catching onto and like amplifying different pieces and different lines based on what I think she knows about me, what she knows about the relationship.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a section of your book, of course, that's the part where you explain the references. And I wonder if the audience you have in your head is the more sort of blank slate, if that sort of helps your composition process to know that you can maybe sneak a little jokey poo under the wire that they don't know about, or if it's if you feel as though your poems are telling the story from scratch, or how you kind of interact with the relationship of your projections of readerly knowledge.
I don't really when I write the poem, I don't think a lot about if someone's going to know the reference. It's like I think that the humor in this book is like a survival tactic,
Yeah.
right? Like it's survival. It's like, okay, like if any vague representation of myself in the Bible is like someone being like raped or subordinate or nameless or like in service of men in these ways, like joking about it in the kind of classic sense is a way of reasserting your own power. And
Yeah.
like, and truly in the most cliche, basic, like joke and laughter as a way of like reclaiming some position of agency in it. And like having it be a very like specific joke is also a way of being like, I know this story in and out.
Yeah.
It's not like a bird's eye view version of the story.
Right.
So if I'm gonna insert myself in these stories, maybe I can laugh at them.
Yeah.
And like if the reader gets that joke, they might be someone who's also like in that position. If they get the joke and they're offended by it, then the reader, for me, it reveals more about the reader's position, like how they respond to it, like if they know the joke, and then if they're like offended by it or if they laugh with it. And I think the reader can figure themselves out around that. I think it becomes a problem when it's a little bit self-indulgent, where it's to the point where like I'm not really like there's nothing else a reader can grab onto if they don't know the stories.
Yeah.
And I think I have some poems like that in here, and that
Oh,
there's some
a
really
poet would
criticism.
never be self-indulgent, CR. I've never known a poet
Yeah,
self-indulgent.
originally I thought this book would never get published because of that problem.
I remember when you sent in the section that was like the footnotes section, and my initial reaction to it was
You're like, no.
"No, I don't want this. I hate this." I think it was when I actually read it, when I realized that, this is just another sort of like metatextual kind of joke. And there are a lot of people, I think, who don't like publishing things that feel like inside jokes because they assume that that's alienating to the reader. When I think that like the fact of it is that when you encounter a joke that feels like intimate and personal that you don't understand, like that's an invitation, to the reader. It's not you're not making fun of the reader. You're not talking down to them. You're inviting them to participate in this act of rereading and reconceptualizing and finding yourself in a way that you wouldn't expect to find yourself. And so, even if I don't get the joke exactly the way that you would make the joke, like I'm still a part of it as a reader, as an unfamiliar reader, in a way that, is intimate and special and like
And
friendly.
that's what I tell my students about why poetry, like
Yeah.
what I love about it, which is you don't have to get it. Like
Yeah.
there are like if you're a comedian,
Mhm.
you need people to get the joke. You
Yeah.
know?
For sure.
But like a poem, like if you don't have to understand what the poem's about, why do you have to perfectly understand the joke? Like, you know,
Yeah.
there's a joke in there,
Yeah.
and you're being given access to the person's experience, which is a lot truer than the actual, like, you know, punchline,
Yeah.
right? Like where the joke's coming from, I think, is in the experience of that, and the feeling you get when you feel like you're suddenly in it, even if you don't totally get it, is a lot more important in a poem than the punchline of the joke per se.
Agree. Yeah, I agree. It's more important to recognize the signal that this is a joke than to understand the punchline, particularly for poetry, I think.
Yeah.